Government policy often creates kinks in worker budget constraints, and in this set of graphs we'll show two types of kinks that might emerge depending on how employers respond to government overtime regulation. By overtime regulation will mean that the government requires an employer to pay overtime, to pay 1.5 times as much for each hour that a worker works on top of the initial 40 hours that he works for that employer. Thus, if you work, for instance, for $20 an hour for an employer who employs you full-time, you'll get paid $20 an hour for the first 40 hours. But if the employer asks you to stay beyond 40 hours, he has to pay you 1.5 times as much per hour for each additional hour, or $30 an hour for the 41st hour, for the 42nd hour, and so forth. Suppose again that you have no savings to draw on for the week, but you have 60 hours that you could sell in the labor market. Your endowment bundle is therefore 60 hours of leisure consumption and no consumption of other goods. This is the bundle that you could consume no matter what the wage was, because it's what you own. If you decide to work full-time, that is 40 hours a week, you will be left with 20 hours of leisure consumption. That will in turn imply that you will consume a bundle C that consists of 20 hours of leisure time and an amount of other goods consumption that's determined by how much you were able to earn in the labor market by selling the 40 hours of leisure that you're not consuming. If your full-time wage was $20 an hour, then you sold your 40 hours at $20 an hour for a total of $800 that you can now spend on other goods. Thus, bundle C would contain 20 hours of leisure and $800 of other goods consumption. Between C and E, the opportunity cost of taking one additional hour of leisure is that you'd give up $20 worth of consumption. Thus, the slope of the budget constraint between C and E is minus 20. This slope reflects the wage rate that you earn for the first 40 hours that you're employed by your employer. The question now becomes, what does your budget constraint look like between bundle C and the vertical axis? And the answer to that depends on how your employer responds and what your other labor market opportunities are. Suppose, for instance, that your employer does not offer overtime. He doesn't offer the opportunity to work for more than 40 hours a week because he doesn't want to pay 1.5 times your usual wage. In that case, if you want to sell more of your 60 hours of leisure in the labor market, you'll have to work somewhere else. Suppose that your next best alternative is to find additional work at only $10 an hour. You would then work for the first 40 hours with your employer earning the $800 that you can earn there, but for the remaining 20 hours, the most you'd be able to get in additional income is an extra $200. The most you'd be able to consume then is $1,000 in other goods consumption, $800 by working for your full-time employer, and then an additional $200 by moonlighting for an additional 20 hours for someone else at $10 an hour. Your remaining budget constraint between bundle C and the vertical axis is then simply formed by connecting bundle B to bundle C. Notice that this magenta line has a slope of minus 10, which is the wage that you can earn at your next best alternative once you've worked for 40 hours for your employer who is not willing to let you work any more than that. This represents one scenario that could unfold for a worker under overtime regulation. The worker works for an employer who pays a good wage, but is not allowing overtime because he doesn't want to pay the extra cost. The worker herself is unable to work for the same wage elsewhere, and therefore takes a pay cut after the first 40 hours a week as she moonlights for someone else. This then creates an outward kink in the worker's budget constraint. Now suppose that your employer changes her mind, and she now permits you to work as much overtime as you'd like, and she intends to follow overtime regulations in calculating your pay. For the first 40 hours, nothing has changed. Thus the budget constraint remains the blue line segment for the first 40 hours of work that you undertake at $20 an hour. The change happens after that. In Panel A, you had to take a pay cut from $20 to $10 an hour once you worked 40 hours, because your employer was not willing to keep you on. Now your employer is not only willing to keep you on, but will pay you $30 an hour for each additional hour that you work. Thus your wage increases from 20 to 30 after you've worked for 40 hours. At $30 an hour, you can sell your remaining 20 hours of leisure time for $600. So the most in other goods consumption you'll now be able to undertake is $1,400 a week, $800 from working for 40 hours, and then $600 by working 20 hours overtime. The budget constraint between bundle C and the vertical axis is now the magenta line segment from bundle B to bundle C. The slope of the magenta line segment is minus 600 divided by 20, or minus 30. In other words, minus your overtime wage rate. Again, this makes sense because in this interval, for every hour that you choose not to work, you're giving up $30 in other goods consumption that you could have gotten. When your employer allows you to take as much overtime as you would like, your budget constraint therefore kinks inward rather than outward as it did in Panel A. There are many different ways in which government policies can create such kinks in budget constraints, through taxes, through subsidies, or through regulation as we saw here. This example is particularly interesting because the kink is not just created by the fact that the government issued a policy. Which way the kink points depends on how individuals in the market respond to the policy. If the employer does allow overtime regulation to go into effect, in other words, if she allows the worker to work overtime, then that creates one kind of kink. If she doesn't allow the worker to work overtime, it might create a different kink if the worker's labor market opportunities are not that great elsewhere. In one case, the worker might be better off because she's able to earn additional income at a higher wage due to the overtime regulation. In the other case, on the other hand, she might be worse off because the employer might have allowed her to stay on and work overtime at $20 an hour, but not at $30 an hour.